Have you ever felt like trapped, like in a tight space maybe trapped in a party you didn't want to really be at? Have you ever felt trapped in an unhealthy relationship or trapped by a habit that you can't seem to change? Trapped in a job you hate and can't leave, trapped by debt. There's so many ways that we can feel like there are chains holding us in place, places we don't want to be. This story from the book of Acts that we read today is about people who are trapped and people finding freedom from the things that entrap them. Well, to begin with, Paul is a person who was trapped by his own belief system. He believed that there was right and there was wrong and there was nothing in between. He was totally focused on being right, and everyone who was wrong should be punished to the full extent of the law. I don't think he even knew how miserable he was until God knocked him off his horse, left him injured and blinded and dependent on help from the very people that he was trying to have killed. He was freed by their gracious care. He was freed to accept and learn to love in a new and different way. So now Paul and his friends are on this road trip to Europe, and they're sharing this experience with everyone that they can. And while talking to a group of people, they encounter a slave girl with a strange ability to tell fortunes. And you might think that was a gift, but that's not how she experienced it. Instead, it felt more like a curse, for she was being used by men who owned her to make them money. This woman, like many others in life, is trapped, captive to something beyond her own choices. Like many people, for many different reasons, there's something that seems to possess her. And when that is the case, individuals are vulnerable to being used and abused by others and by the culture itself. So this young fortune teller's spiritual insight seemed to draw her towards Paul and his friends, and she knows them and knows their names and who they are and what they're doing, and she starts calling out, "These are servants of the Most High God who are telling you the way to be saved." And she keeps saying it over and over again. And Paul, getting frustrated by the disruption and maybe feeling the pain of her situation, he turns to her and he calls the spirit out of her right there and then. And she's set free. And Paul's next entrapment begins, as her owners realize that their investment has been ruined. William Loader points out that this outrage that the slave girl's owners felt is, well, something we find today just as much as it would have been there then. For if you do anything which is likely to lead to diminishing returns for investors, you must just be wrong from the very start. Unfortunately, we seem to have accepted this as the way of the world. Everyone and everything is a potential product to be tapped and exploited. But in this story, God's love breaks this cycle. When God's compassion gets into the marketplace, well, those sharing this good news become instruments of confrontation. Now, Christians should be good citizens, but sometimes to be true to our faith, they and we must stand up for people in ways that those in authority will find irritating and interfering. And that's what Paul and Silas did. So they're attacked for practicing this kind of faith. They were beaten for setting someone free who was being used for selfish financial gain. They were thrown into prisons, their bodies were trapped, but we find that their spirits were still free. Paul and Silas are in stocks, they are unable to move, so they sing. That is the way of those who are truly free. To be centered in God enables singing no matter your circumstances. Martin Luther King and the freedom fighters sang while they were in jail. So So while behind bars, Paul and Silas are suffering with the other prisoners, and they're praying and they're singing. Calling on the presence of God is the way that they knew to stay sane in these untenable circumstances. And then suddenly an earthquake shakes the foundations of the prison and leaves the doors open and their chains loosened. And you would think their initial reaction would be to get out of there as quickly as possible. It was a miracle just for them. But what Paul and Silas show us through their actions and their compassion for those around them is that though it may have been an appearance of a door being opened, a way of escape, well, life's not that simple. Now, according to the Roman law, the Philippian jailer was responsible for all of the prisoners. And so when he woke up from his sleep after this earthquake and he saw that the prison doors were open, he knew at that moment his life and his work were at stake. And not seeing any other way out, he draws his sword and he's about to kill himself and get it over with. But rather than run, they wait. Paul's compassion for the one who had held him prisoner stops him from running. This is compassion that moves beyond our individual wants and our comforts, even the possibility of our own freedom. This compassion is a suffering with others. And the fact that Paul makes this connection with this other human being is life-changing. And this is why the story is important. You know, sometimes we tend to get stuck on the miraculous elements of the stories when we're reading the scriptures. So if you believe in miracles without a doubt, you might think that the point of the story is that God casts out spirits and can cause earthquakes to open jails. If you're not so sure that miracles actually break the laws of nature, well, then you might dismiss this story as meaningless. But either of those approaches misses the true, deeper meaning of this story. Because this story is about changing the way that we live in the world. It's about noticing the pain in others around us and taking the risk of helping them out of their chains, whatever those chains might be. Paul offers an enslaved young woman a way out. And he stops the jailer from committing suicide and shows him another way to live in community. It's interesting, the jailer asks, "How can I be saved?" And again, we tend to assume that he means what we think that means. But he may have meant a number of things. He may have been asking, "How can I be saved from the Roman soldiers who are about to come after me and want to kill me?" He may have been asking, "How can I be free of my life of constant fear?" He might be saying, "I'm afraid of my boss, I'm afraid of my job, and you were in prison and in stocks, and you're more free than I was. You were physically set free and you didn't run. That's what I want to know. That's who I want to be. How can I be saved from the life that I'm living?" For him and for many, alone, death seems inevitable. But together, looking out for each other, new life is possible. The jailer who was ready to end his own life is given hope. And notice that in this beautiful scene of mutual caring and finding freedom from what entraps us, water represents the Spirit at work in the world. The jailer washes their wounds with water. And then Paul and Silas baptize the family as guests in their home, and together they share a meal of hope. The violence and confinement of the first part of this story are reversed and transformed into freedom and hospitality and faith. And the story doesn't end once that freedom is realized. That's because community is needed to help those coming out of their entrapment. Community is needed for all of us who find ourselves formerly enslaved, newly free. The ability to move into what God intends for us requires community. And this is the way the Spirit of God works in the world. It starts with us sharing our stories of faith and struggle. And now we see that receiving hospitality from those hearing our message. This had been a part of the beginning of this movement of the church from the start. The household becomes a church fellowship, a place for welcoming others, of sharing meals, of telling the stories of lives being changed. This is what God does. This is how God works in our world. Our purpose and our calling is to meet one another where we are, of helping one another out of our entrapment. And often as we make the effort to do that, we find ourselves lifted out of our own fears and the false beliefs that entrap us. This is our identity. This is our mission as individuals and as a congregation, as a family of faith. This kind of faith is lived out each day. It's lived out each day here by our volunteers and our staff who work for the In-Town Collaborative Ministries, who walk side by side with our friends who are living in homelessness, providing the love and the resources they need to step into new possibilities. This is the Spirit of God inspiring our mission team to build friendships in villages in Chiapas, Mexico, raising funds and providing resources for them to start their own cooperative ventures, lifting one another up, providing them what they need to lift themselves out of the poverty that has trapped them for years. This is the kind of faith that is alive where chaplains in prison ministry help those whose bodies are chained to set their hearts free. It happens as Elias Crosby and Hannah Hill are helping prisoners prepare to re-enter society, finding work and shelter as they rebuild relationships so that their lives might truly be free. This is what happens when we make space for support recovery groups to end the oppression of addiction that has entrapped them. And it happens right here, listening to one another's stories as we share our grief and our joys, as we share our fears and our beliefs, sometimes even the beliefs that hold us captive, so that together we might know the freedom and the peace that God offers. And all of these everyday, down-to-earth, miraculous transformations are happening as together we read the words of Jesus, the wisdom that's taught, the life that is surrendered, as we accept God's gift of unconditional love, as we do today in the symbols of bread and wine. And then as we continue to write the story of a Creator still creating a beloved community right here in our midst, and as we sing.